You need some oxygen now. Okay, Federico, you can continue.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for introducing, Chris. Basically, you've done it already. Armed guards, this is basically the subject that we are going to develop now. There is a lot of activity going on, particularly here in Italy. Last year, or 2 years ago, it was successfully implemented the naval teams, which have been working perfectly. There are still a number of logistic problems in there, in terms of numbers, in terms of availability, and so on. So the discussion is now going on the possibility of employing private contractors to do the job. The new regulation is expected, we all hope, by the end of the year. There has been a lot of activity going on in trying to make it, as feasible as possible for the owners. We are not going to discuss about this. One key for the employment of private contractors, doesn't matter whether they are armed or non-armed, is clearly the terms of the contract under which they are employed. This is what Chris South, who's a Deputy Director of the West of England, and particularly he has been the representative from the international group at the committee which came to the drafting, to the drafting of the BINCO Guardcom, which is actually the contract which everybody today recommends to use for this kind of operations. It is approved by the clubs, which is the most important thing. Contracts needs to be approved by your underwriters. Chris.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in such august company. Coming from London, it's always a pleasure to be in Naples, though I have to say I am slightly emotionally torn by the thought of sitting in the Piazza in Capri with a glass of Prosecco on a day like today. Unfortunately, that's not happening. I'm here, and we're going to be talking about armed guards. And... Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. I'm not great with technology. I apologize. We're facing a unique problem. The shipping industry has faced a unique problem. And we're talking about putting civilians on ships with guns to potentially kill people. That is a very, very unique situation. I've been in the shipping industry 30 years, and I never thought I'd be addressing conferences or drafting contracts for civilians with guns on ships to potentially kill people. It's very unusual. And the problem is the industry had to respond in the absence of any international regime, law, anything. But the industry had to respond because the crews were the ones who are suffering, as we heard this morning in the introductory speech. Yes, everybody's worried about the ship and the cargo, but what we should really be worried about is the crews, who suffer maltreatment, fear, psychological damage, sometimes death. Industry responded with the creation of private armed security. The industry has exploded. There are over 200 companies now offering private security. The Security Association for Maritime Industry, SAMI, has over 174 members. There are new companies being formed almost weekly in many different countries. So there was a desperate need for standardization. I personally have looked at over 80 different companies' contracts before Guardcom was published, probably 200 variations of those. It was becoming uncontrollable for ship owners and, in fact, for the guard companies. So there was a desperate need for standardization. Stephen has mentioned the problem about regulation of the industry. At the moment, there is no regulation. He's made some very interesting comments about the forthcoming ISO standard, and I actually agree with Stephen's observations. Any standard is only as good as the people who get to regulate it. So that is a concern going forwards. The IMO eventually did come out with some guidelines. 1405 is addressed to ship owners, guidelines about the employment of armed guards. The most interesting section is, of course, it talks about the due diligence ship owners should go into in selecting their guard company. Guidelines are not law. But in the case of, in the event of an incident, this is probably what any court would refer back to at the moment to see, Mr. Shipowner, did you exercise due diligence in choosing your guards? The IMO have also finally issued some guidelines to the guard companies, IMO 1443. And ship owners, when carrying out their due diligence, would be wise to ask prospective guard companies, show how you are compliant with 1443, because at the moment this is the one international standard document, and it sets out a good structure for how PMSC companies should be formed. As I say, 1405 makes it very clear, the documents addressed to ship owners, that the employment of armed guards is not a substitute for best management practice, currently BMP 4. And similarly, 1443, the document addressed to the guards, makes it clear that the use of force should be part of a graduated response and always following implementation of the latest version of best management practice. So from the point of view of insurers and industry as a whole, BMP must be applied. And if an owner does not apply BMP, he may well create problems not only with his insurance, but also in regard to collecting contributions and general average from cargo interests. It is fundamental that BMP is applied. There's the issue of the legality of employing armed guards, because if the employment of the armed guards is illegal, that will probably invalidate insurance so far as any liabilities arising, because you cannot insure yourself against the consequences of committing a crime, and the employment of armed guards illegally is probably a criminal act in most jurisdictions. So it is very important that a ship owner has his flag state approval to employ private armed guards, but also that he has the guards are licensed themselves. There's been a lot of debate about how many guards, and the BIMCO contract says 4. But what is clear in both 1443 and 1405 is that there must be a risk assessment to assess how many guards should be employed. And many owners, I fear, do not do proper risk assessments, but in the event of an incident, they will have to produce their risk assessment to justify their actions. So why do we have GuardCon? Well, as I mentioned, there are over 200 companies in many different jurisdictions. What was necessary was to establish a fixed contract whereby both parties, the guards and the owners, clearly understood what their contractual relationship was. It establishes the need for who the guards are who are being provided under the contract. What is the command and control regime between the master and the guards? What is the balance of liabilities? What are the insurance requirements? A guidance on the rules of use of force, but also, as Stephen said, a contract acceptable to owners, P&I insurers. BIMCO decided to form a committee in December 2011, and we published a contract in 2012. It's the fastest document BIMCO have ever produced. We consulted with industry, with market underwriters, and also with the UK Crown Prosecution Service to ensure we understand the concepts of self-defence. One point I want to make on the contract is that the clubs are adamant that the owners are party to the contract. There are many instances where charterers have arranged for guards or even pool operators, but it is the owner who has the legal responsibility for having armed guards on his ship. Therefore, the owner must have a contractual relationship with those guards. So the owner must be a party. The contract contains lots of clauses, but here I've listed the fundamental ones which we do not expect to see changed. The other clauses, which are really commercial clauses, we don't worry about too much. But these are the essential clauses that go to the core of the contract. I look at a couple of them very briefly, be mindful of time, and Mr. Diodati is threatening to shoot me if I run over, which I am going to run over, I'm sorry. There has clearly got to be a command and control regime between the master and the armed guards. These are civilians. They're not military personnel, they're civilians. This is clear in both the IMO documents and, of course, under SOLAS, the master cannot derogate from his responsibility as commander of the vessel. However, we do not want masters being involved in any decision to use weapons, because the master is an expert in navigation and management of his vessel. He is not a security expert. So we established in Clause 8 a regime which recognises the master's authority, but also recognises that the guards are the people who are the experts and who will be using the weapons. It is clear under most laws that no civilian can give another civilian an order to use a weapon. In fact, the choice to use a weapon has to be the decision of the individual pulling the trigger, relying upon rules of self-defense or collective self-defense. No civilian can give another civilian an order to shoot. The master always can order, do not shoot. They're fishermen, do not shoot. They're not actually threatening us. But if the individual guard thinks that that guy is pointing a gun or is threatening his life, he has a right under criminal law of self-defense. The master cannot order a shooting. He can only ask them not to. But if the guy still says, actually, my life's been threatened, I am going to use my weapon, but then the guard has to justify himself before a criminal court on the basis of self-defense. Insurance. The IMO document says that the guards must have insurance. In fact, the IMO document mirrors the insurance requirements to an extent of the GuardCon contract. GuardCon says that they must have $5 million liability insurance and a high level of personal accident insurance, etc. What has caused most problems when we're looking at these contracts has been the fact that the guards have not had contractual indemnity insurance. They've had liability insurance, but liability insurance is dependent upon the guard or the guard company's own fault. But where you have contractual indemnity, imagine the guard is on the ship's ladder collapses, there is no fault or negligence, but under the contract, the guard company is responsible for their own personnel. The individual guard may sue the ship. The ship then says to the guard company, indemnify me under knock for knock. If the guard company only has liability insurance, it will not respond. The guard company must have contractual indemnity insurance. It has been the biggest problem so far. There are now covers available to the guard companies, and they're at very reasonable prices. We drafted guidance to the rules of the use of force. We did not draft actual rules of the use of force because it depends upon the law of many different laws. What is clear, though, is the IMO requires a graduated, proportionate, and necessary response before a weapon is used. You have to justify it. You've done everything possible to avoid shooting somebody before you may have a right under self-defense. Because as Stephen also alluded to, in the event of a shooting incident, you don't necessarily know what law will be applied to try the person who pulled the trigger and or the master. So, in conclusion, you need to be aware of illegality. You must comply with flag state law. Owners should follow due diligence under the IMO guidance, and asking the guard companies to show that they follow the IMO guidance 1443. Licenses are critically important. If a guard's operating without licenses, it may be illegal, and that could have implications for the owners. Use GuardCon. It is approved by the international group. It is recognized, I think, now internationally. And in fact, if companies come to me without GuardCon, I tend to reject them. Insurance is there, but remember, at the end of the day, it is not a substitute using armed guards for BMP. You must use BMP first. And if you don't use BMP, you may be opening yourself up to some serious problems. But the best advice is if you apply BMP and are vigilant, and you see the guys coming who may be a threat, you can start taking evasive maneuvers, and most of the time they'll go away. The Somali pirates are not out there to get killed. That is not their game plan. So if you actually say, we've seen you, we've taken evasive maneuvers, we've fired flares, ship's horn, what have you, quite often they'll go away. They'll look for an easier victim. I have now overrun. I am very sorry, but thank you very much.